Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Millhaven County, Pennsylvania. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1888 in Millhaven County arrived with an unusual chill that seemed to settle into the very bones of the countryside. The coal mining towns scattered across the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania had grown accustomed to harsh winters. But that year brought something different, a cold that felt deliberate, almost personal. Among the residents of Cedar Ridge, a small community nestled between the Allegheny foothills and the Yohogany River, few paid much attention to the modest advertisement that appeared in the Weekly Gazette on October 15th. Fine winter garments expertly crafted. Reasonable prices. Inquire at the Hemlock Cottage 1 mile north of Miller's Bridge. The advertisement was signed simply C. Moravec, though most locals knew it referred to Cordelia Moravec, the Czech immigrant who had moved to Cedar Ridge 3 years prior following the death of her husband in a mining accident near Pittsburgh. What made the advertisement particularly noteworthy wasn't its modest tone or the promise of reasonable prices, but rather the extraordinary quality of the garments Mrs. Moravec had begun producing that season. According to records maintained by the Cedar Ridge General Store, owned and operated by Jeremiah Caldwell, the first customers to visit Mrs. Moravec's cottage returned with coats unlike anything previously seen in the region. The materials appeared to be some form of fur, yet no one could identify the animal of origin. The pelts were remarkably soft, with an unusual sheen that seemed to shift from deep brown to nearly black depending on the angle of observation. More striking still was the warmth these garments provided, a heat that seemed to emanate from the material itself, requiring no layers underneath even during the coldest days. Mrs. Moravec's cottage sat at the end of a winding dirt path that branched off from the main road leading to Miller's Bridge. The structure itself was unremarkable, a single-story dwelling built of local fieldstone with a slate roof, typical of the region's modest architecture. What distinguished the property was the large workshop shed behind the main house, a building that Mrs. Moravec had constructed herself during her first year of residence. Neighbors occasionally noticed smoke rising from the shed's chimney at all hours, often late into the night, though the smell that drifted on the wind was unlike that of burning wood or coal. Some described it as sweet, almost floral, while others detected an underlying note that reminded them of leather being cured. The first documented concern regarding Mrs. Moravec's business practices appears in a letter written by Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore to his sister in Philadelphia, dated November 2, 1888. Reverend Whitmore served the Methodist congregation in Cedar Ridge and maintained detailed correspondence about the spiritual and social conditions of his community. In this particular letter, preserved in the archives of the Philadelphia Methodist Historical Society, he wrote, "I confess myself troubled by the manner in which our Mrs. Moravec conducts her trade. While I cannot fault the quality of her work, indeed, several of my parishioners have purchased her garments and speak of their excellence, there is something in her methods that gives me pause. She insists on meeting with each customer privately, often for periods exceeding 2 hours. When I inquired about this practice, she explained that proper fitting requires careful measurement and consideration of the customer's specific needs. Yet I have observed that those who visit her cottage often emerge appearing changed, not ill precisely, but subdued in a manner that strikes me as unnatural." The Reverend's observations were shared by others in the community, though few spoke openly about their concerns. According to oral histories collected by historian Marjorie Fenwick in 1952, several residents of Cedar Ridge noted that customers of Mrs. Moravec's workshop began exhibiting peculiar behaviors following their visits. They became more withdrawn, less inclined to participate in community gatherings, and seemed to prefer solitary activities. Most notably, they displayed an unusual attachment to their new garments, wearing them constantly regardless of weather conditions or social appropriateness. Barnabas Hutchins, a local farmer and frequent customer of Caldwell's General Store, was among the first to purchase one of Mrs. Moravec's coats. Hutchins had farmed the same plot of land near Cedar Ridge for over 20 years and was known for his practical nature and strong work ethic. According to his wife Temperance's diary, discovered during the estate sale following her death in 1923, Barnabas visited Mrs. Moravec's cottage on October 20th, 1888, seeking a warm coat for the approaching winter months. Temperance's entries regarding this period provide insight into the gradual changes that occurred following her husband's purchase. Her entry from October 22nd reads, "Barnabas returned yesterday evening with the most beautiful coat I have ever seen. The fur is of a type unknown to me, soft as rabbit, but with the depth of color found in mink. When I asked about the animal from which it came, he said only that Mrs. Moravec explained it was a European variety, uncommon in this region. He has scarcely removed the garment since bringing it home, even wearing it to bed last night, despite the warmth of our bedroom." By November, Temperance's entries reveal growing concern about her husband's behavior. Barnabas has become increasingly distant. He completes his farm duties, but speaks little, even during meals. Most disturbing is his insistence on visiting Mrs. Moravec's cottage every Wednesday evening. When I ask about these visits, he says they discuss proper care of the garment, though such conversations surely require less than the 3 hours he spends there each week. I have begun to fear that the widow has some hold over him, though I cannot imagine what form such influence might take. The pattern observed in Barnabas Hutchins was repeated among other customers of Mrs. Moravec's workshop. Isadora Fleming, wife of the local bank president, purchased a coat in early November and subsequently began declining social invitations, preferring to spend her time alone in her parlor. Cornelius Blackwater, owner of the largest farm in the county, acquired a coat for his wife Prudence and, within a month, was observed by neighbors to have lost considerable weight and developed a habit of walking alone along the riverbank during the coldest hours of the night. The workshop behind Mrs. Moravec's cottage became a source of particular curiosity and concern among Cedar Ridge residents. Those who passed by the property during evening hours reported seeing shadows moving behind the curtained windows, though Mrs. Moravec claimed to live alone. The smoke that rose from the building's chimney carried that peculiar sweet odor that seemed to intensify during certain phases of the moon, particularly during the new moon when the workshop appeared to be most active. Dr. Sylvanus Heath, the only physician serving Cedar Ridge and the surrounding townships, began to notice changes in several of his patients during the latter months of 1888. His medical journal, donated to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1941, contains entries describing a variety of symptoms among those who had purchased garments from Mrs. Moravec's workshop. Patients reported improved circulation and decreased sensitivity to cold, which Dr. Heath initially attributed to the superior insulation provided by the coats. However, other symptoms proved more difficult to explain. Several patients exhibited significant changes in appetite, specifically an aversion to meat that had previously been their preferred food. Others developed an unusual sensitivity to bright light and began requesting evening appointments for routine medical consultations. Perhaps most concerning to Dr. Heath was the fact that multiple patients began expressing a desire to visit Mrs. Moravec's cottage more frequently than their original purpose would suggest. When questioned about these visits, patients offered vague explanations about garment maintenance or discussions about additional purchases, yet few seemed to acquire any new items during these repeated trips. The mystery surrounding Mrs. Moravec's materials deepened when Jeremiah Caldwell attempted to investigate the source of her supplies. As the proprietor of the general store that served the entire region, Caldwell maintained relationships with merchants and suppliers throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states. He made discreet inquiries about exotic fur traders, European importers, and specialty textile merchants, yet none could identify the type of material used in Mrs. Moravec's garments. In December 1888, Caldwell approached Mrs. Moravec directly, ostensibly to discuss the possibility of carrying her products in his store. According to his own account, recorded in a letter to his brother in Baltimore, the conversation proved deeply unsettling. The woman received me cordially enough, though her manner was strange. She spoke in whispers even when we were quite alone, and seemed constantly aware of sounds that I could not detect. When I inquired about her suppliers, her expression changed entirely. She claimed that her materials came from family sources in the old country, inherited methods passed down through generations. Yet, when I pressed for details, she became evasive, finally stating that some knowledge was too dangerous to share freely. What troubled Caldwell most about the visit was Mrs. Moravec's workshop. Though she showed him only the front room where she met with customers, he glimpsed into the rear section through a partially open doorway. The space beyond was filled with what appeared to be large vats or containers, and the air carried a smell that reminded him of the rendering facility near the slaughterhouse in Pittsburgh. When he mentioned this observation to Mrs. Moravec, she quickly closed the door and stated that the rear workshop contained materials that were sensitive to exposure and required careful handling. By January 1889, the peculiar atmosphere surrounding Mrs. Moravec's business had begun to affect the broader community. Regular customers of her workshop had become an insular group, often gathering at each other's homes, but avoiding larger community functions. They seemed to communicate through glances and subtle gestures that excluded non-customers, creating an unspoken division within Cedar Ridge society. The situation reached a concerning point when several families reported that their relatives who owned Mrs. Moravec's garments had begun experiencing sleep disturbances. Temperance Hutchins noted in her diary that Barnabas had developed a habit of rising during the darkest hours of the night and walking outside, often not returning until dawn. When she followed him on one occasion, she observed him standing motionless in their yard, facing in the direction of Mrs. Moravec's cottage, remaining perfectly still for hours despite the bitter cold. Similar reports came from other families. Spouses and relatives described loved ones exhibiting trance-like behavior during nighttime hours, always while wearing their purchased garments. Some were found standing in gardens or fields, others walking slowly along the river path that led toward Mrs. Moravec's property. All shared the characteristic of perfect stillness and apparent obliviousness to cold, wind, or precipitation. Dr. Heath documented these episodes in his medical journal, initially suspecting some form of sleepwalking disorder. However, the coordination and purposefulness of the movements suggested conscious behavior rather than unconscious wandering. More puzzling was the fact that when awakened or questioned, the affected individuals had no memory of leaving their homes and appeared genuinely confused about finding themselves outdoors. The breakthrough in understanding Mrs. Moravec's operation came through an unexpected source. A traveling merchant named Mordecai Steenberg, who passed through Cedar Ridge in February 1889. Steenberg traded in exotic goods and unusual materials throughout the eastern states and had extensive knowledge of rare textiles and animal products. When shown examples of Mrs. Moravec's work by Jeremiah Caldwell, his reaction was immediate and alarming. According to Caldwell's account, Steenberg examined the garments with great care before declaring that the material was unlike anything in his experience. The texture and properties suggested fur from a large mammal, yet the hair structure and follicle patterns were inconsistent with any known species. Most disturbing was Steenberg's observation that the material appeared to retain some form of cellular activity, evidenced by subtle changes in texture and color when exposed to body heat. Steenberg's expertise led him to a conclusion that Caldwell initially dismissed as impossible. The materials used in Mrs. Moravec's garments were not derived from animals at all, but appeared to be processed human hair, treated through some unknown method to achieve the appearance and properties of fur. When pressed for evidence to support this extraordinary claim, Steenberg pointed to microscopic characteristics visible only under magnification, patterns of growth and cellular structure that he insisted were consistent with human rather than animal origins. This revelation cast Mrs. Moravec's operation in an entirely new and horrifying light. If Steenberg's analysis was correct, the source of the materials used in her garments raised questions too disturbing to contemplate directly. The quantity of hair required to produce even a single coat would necessitate the complete harvesting from multiple human sources. Yet no reports of missing persons had been filed in Cedar Ridge or the surrounding communities. Jeremiah Caldwell found himself faced with an impossible situation. Steenberg's claims suggested criminal activity of the most heinous nature, yet no direct evidence existed to support such accusations. Mrs. Moravec continued to operate her business openly. Her customers remained satisfied with their purchases, and no obvious crimes had been committed within the community. Nevertheless, Caldwell felt compelled to share his concerns with local authorities. The constable for Cedar Ridge and the surrounding township was Cyrus Whitman, a retired Army sergeant who had served in that capacity for 15 years. Whitman was known for his practical approach to law enforcement and his reluctance to pursue investigations based on speculation or community rumors. When Caldwell presented him with Steenberg's assessment of Mrs. Moravec's materials, Whitman's initial response was skeptical. However, Whitman agreed to conduct a discreet investigation of Mrs. Moravec's activities. His approach was methodical and careful, designed to gather information without alerting Mrs. Moravec to official interest in her business. He began by reviewing records from surrounding communities for reports of missing persons, particularly those that might have occurred during Mrs. Moravec's residence in Cedar Ridge. He also made inquiries about her background, attempting to verify her claims about inheritance from family sources in Europe. The investigation revealed several troubling inconsistencies in Mrs. Moravec's history. Records from the mining company that had employed her deceased husband contained no mention of a Cordelia Moravec, nor any documentation of death benefits paid to such a widow. Immigration records from the Port of Philadelphia showed no entry for anyone matching her description during the period when she claimed to have arrived in America. More concerning was Whitman's discovery that similar businesses had operated in other communities throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states during the 1880s. In each case, a woman matching Mrs. Moravec's general description had established a textile workshop specializing in unusual fur garments, operated successfully for several years, then disappeared without notice, leaving no forwarding address or explanation for her departure. The pattern was remarkably consistent. The businesses always emerged in isolated rural communities with limited communication with larger cities, always focused on a specific type of fur garment with unusual properties, and always attracted a devoted customer base that exhibited similar behavioral changes. Most significantly, each community reported a slight but noticeable increase in missing persons cases during the period of operation, though these disappearances were typically attributed to the transient nature of rural populations rather than criminal activity. Armed with this information, Constable Whitman decided to conduct a direct investigation of Mrs. Moravec's property. Pennsylvania law permitted peace officers to inspect business premises when reasonable suspicion of criminal activity existed, though Whitman was careful to frame his visit as a routine inquiry about business licensing rather than a criminal investigation. Mrs. Moravec received Whitman politely but with obvious nervousness when he arrived at her cottage on March 15, 1889. She readily provided access to the front portion of her workshop where she conducted customer fittings and maintained finished garments. This area appeared normal in all respects, well organized, clean, and containing nothing that would suggest improper activities. However, when Whitman requested access to the rear workshop area, Mrs. Moravec became agitated. She claimed that the space contained materials that were dangerous to handle improperly and that exposure to certain chemicals used in her processing methods could cause illness in untrained individuals. When Whitman insisted that his investigation required complete access to the premises, Mrs. Moravec reluctantly agreed but insisted on accompanying him to ensure that nothing was disturbed. The rear workshop defied Whitman's expectations entirely. Rather than containing the large vats or rendering equipment suggested by previous descriptions, the space was filled with what appeared to be an elaborate laboratory. Tables lined the walls, covered with glass containers, measuring instruments, and apparatus that resembled medical equipment more than textile machinery. The sweet odor that neighbors had detected was stronger here, emanating from numerous sealed jars containing what appeared to be various chemical solutions. Most unsettling was a series of detailed diagrams mounted on the walls, depicting what appeared to be anatomical studies of human hair growth patterns, cellular structures, and processing methods. The level of scientific detail suggested expertise far beyond what would be expected from a simple garment maker, indicating knowledge of chemistry, biology, and medical procedures that would require formal training. Mrs. Moravec explained the equipment as necessary for her specialized processing methods, claiming that the transformation of raw materials into the finished fur-like texture required careful chemical treatment and precise temperature control. When Whitman inquired about her training in such technical procedures, she repeated her earlier claims about family knowledge passed down through generations, though her explanations became increasingly vague and contradictory. The most disturbing discovery came when Whitman examined the storage area where Mrs. Moravec kept her raw materials. Large wooden containers held what appeared to be bundles of hair in various stages of processing. The quantity was enormous, representing what would require harvesting from hundreds of sources to accumulate. When questioned about the origins of these materials, Mrs. Moravec claimed they were imported from European suppliers who specialized in collecting hair from willing donors, though she could provide no documentation of such purchases or importation. Whitman's examination of the hair itself revealed characteristics that supported Steenberg's earlier assessment. The color variations, length patterns, and cellular structure were inconsistent with any animal fur, but matched human hair in all observable aspects. Most troubling was the fact that many of the bundles appeared to have been removed from the source quite recently, showing no signs of the deterioration that would be expected from materials stored for extended periods. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Whitman discovered a hidden compartment beneath the workshop floor. The space contained detailed records of Mrs. Moravec's customers, but these documents revealed information that had never been requested during normal business transactions. Customer profiles included physical descriptions, personal habits, family relationships, and what appeared to be schedules of daily activities, suggesting surveillance that went far beyond simple commercial interest. Among these records were detailed maps of the surrounding region, marking specific locations with symbols that corresponded to individual customer profiles. Many of these locations appeared to represent secluded areas along the river in wooded sections, or near abandoned mining sites. When cross-referenced with the customer surveillance records, a disturbing pattern emerged. Customers were being systematically tracked, their movements monitored, and their access to isolated areas carefully documented. The final piece of evidence came from a journal written in a language that Whitman could not identify, but which contained detailed sketches that left no doubt about Mrs. Moravec's true activities. The drawings depicted human figures in various states, processes that appeared to involve systematic harvesting of hair and what looked like disposal methods for remains. The level of detail and clinical precision suggested extensive experience with such procedures. Faced with evidence of criminal activity beyond anything in his previous experience, Whitman immediately contacted authorities in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia for assistance. However, when investigators arrived from the city 3 days later, they found Mrs. Moravec's cottage empty. She had disappeared during the night following Whitman's investigation, taking with her all portable equipment and materials, but leaving behind the built-in apparatus that would have been too large to transport easily. The investigation of the abandoned workshop revealed additional evidence that confirmed the worst suspicions about Mrs. Moravec's activities. Beneath the building, investigators discovered a carefully constructed disposal system that led to an underground chamber connected to the nearby river through a series of drainage channels. The chamber contained evidence of organic materials that had been processed through what appeared to be an acid-based decomposition system, leaving only mineral residues and trace elements that required laboratory analysis to identify. Chemical analysis of residues found in the disposal chamber confirmed the presence of human remains, though the processing had been so thorough that individual identification was impossible. Estimates suggested that materials from dozens of sources had been processed through the system over the period of Mrs. Moravec's residence in Cedar Ridge, yet local missing person reports could account for only a fraction of this number. The investigation expanded to examine the behavioral changes observed in Mrs. Moravec's customers during her period of operation. Dr. Heath's medical records provided crucial evidence that the garments had been treated with substances that produced psychological effects in those who wore them. Chemical analysis of fabric samples revealed traces of compounds that could induce trance-like states, reduce awareness of surroundings, and create compulsive behaviors, including unconscious movement toward specific locations during nighttime hours. The realization that Mrs. Moravec had been using her customers as unknowing accomplices in her operation added another layer of horror to the case. The midnight wanderings that families had observed were not random behavior, but programmed responses designed to bring victims to predetermined locations where they could be harvested without resistance. The gradual isolation of customers from community activities had been intended to reduce the likelihood that absences would be noticed or investigated. Recovery of customers from the effects of the treated garments proved to be a prolonged process. Dr. Heath documented that individuals continued to experience compulsive behaviors for weeks after ceasing to wear the contaminated clothing. Some never fully recovered their previous personalities, remaining withdrawn and showing permanent changes in sleep patterns, appetite, and social interaction. The psychological trauma of realizing their unconscious participation in Mrs. Moravec's activities affected several customers so severely that they required permanent medical supervision. The investigation also revealed that Cedar Ridge had not been Mrs. Moravec's first or only location of operation. Coordination with authorities in other states uncovered a trail of similar businesses spanning nearly a decade, always following the same pattern of establishment, operation, and sudden abandonment. The total scope of her activities suggested that hundreds of victims had been processed through her system across multiple communities, making her among the most prolific criminals in American history. Despite extensive efforts by law enforcement agencies across multiple states, Mrs. Moravec was never located or apprehended. Descriptions of her had been so carefully controlled during her period in Cedar Ridge that even regular customers could provide only vague details about her appearance. She appeared to possess extensive knowledge of criminal investigation methods and had constructed her identity and operations to minimize the possibility of detection or pursuit. The case officially remained open in Pennsylvania state records until 1954, though active investigation ceased after 1892. Periodic reports suggested possible sightings of similar operations in remote areas of the Western Territories, but none could be confirmed or connected definitively to the same individual. The development of more sophisticated criminal investigation techniques and improved communication between law enforcement agencies made the type of operation Mrs. Moravec had conducted increasingly difficult to maintain without detection. The cottage that had housed Mrs. Moravec's operation was demolished by county authorities in 1890, and the site was declared unsuitable for residential construction due to contamination from the chemical processing that had occurred there. The property remained vacant until 1923, when it was converted to agricultural use after extensive soil treatment to remove toxic residues. Local residents continued to avoid the area, and the land changed hands multiple times before finally being incorporated into a larger farm operation in the 1940s. Physical evidence from Mrs. Moravec's workshop was preserved by Pennsylvania state authorities and eventually transferred to the newly established Federal Bureau of Investigation for inclusion in their criminal methodology studies. The case became part of training materials for investigators specializing in serial crimes and served as an example of the sophisticated methods that could be employed by determined criminals operating in isolated communities with limited communication infrastructure. The psychological impact of the Mrs. Moravec case on the Cedar Ridge community persisted for decades after her disappearance. Many families relocated to other regions, unable to remain in an area associated with such horrific discoveries. Those who stayed found that community social patterns had been permanently altered by the revelation that neighbors had been unknowingly participating in criminal activities. Trust between residents required years to rebuild, and the community never regained the close-knit character it had possessed before 1888. Dr. Heath continued to treat former customers of Mrs. Moravec's operation until his retirement in 1912. His detailed medical records of their recovery provided valuable information about the long-term effects of chemical manipulation and psychological trauma, contributing to early understanding of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Several of his patients never fully recovered their previous mental state, requiring lifelong medical supervision and support from family members. The case also influenced changes in business licensing and oversight procedures in rural Pennsylvania communities. Local authorities were granted expanded powers to inspect commercial operations, particularly those involving unfamiliar materials or processing methods. Requirements for documentation of supply sources and processing procedures were strengthened to prevent similar operations from establishing themselves without proper scrutiny. Jeremiah Caldwell, whose investigation had ultimately led to the discovery of Mrs. Moravec's activities, never fully recovered from his knowledge of the case. According to family correspondence preserved in the Cedar Ridge Historical Society, he suffered from persistent nightmares and developed an obsessive concern about the safety of community members. He eventually sold his general store and relocated to Ohio, where he lived quietly until his death in 1919. Constable Cyrus Whitman received commendation from state authorities for his investigation of the case, but the experience marked the end of his career in law enforcement. He resigned his position 6 months after Mrs. Moravec's disappearance, stating that the case had revealed criminal possibilities he was not equipped to handle. He spent his remaining years as a farmer, avoiding any involvement in legal or investigative activities. The broader implications of the Mrs. Moravec case extended beyond the immediate criminal investigation to influence academic study of criminal behavior and community security. Criminologists studying the case noted that the isolation and limited communication systems of rural communities created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by determined criminals with sufficient planning and patience. The case contributed to arguments for improved transportation and communication infrastructure to enhance security in remote areas. Historical analysis of the case also revealed the sophisticated level of planning and scientific knowledge required to conduct such an operation. Mrs. Moravec had demonstrated expertise in chemistry, psychology, anatomy, and criminal methodology that suggested formal education or training far beyond what her assumed background would indicate. This raised questions about whether she had operated independently or as part of a larger criminal organization with access to specialized knowledge and resources. The mystery of Mrs. Moravec's true identity was never resolved despite extensive investigation by multiple law enforcement agencies. No records could be found matching her description in immigration documents, educational institutions, or professional organizations that might have provided her with the scientific knowledge she demonstrated. Her ability to maintain such a sophisticated operation while avoiding detection suggested either exceptional individual capability or support from sources that were never identified. In 1965, during renovation of an abandoned building in Pittsburgh, workers discovered documents that appeared to be related to Mrs. Moravec's activities. The papers included chemical formulas, processing procedures, and references to other locations where similar operations might have been conducted. However, the documents had deteriorated severely during their decades of storage, and much of the information was illegible or incomplete. What could be recovered supported earlier evidence about the scope and sophistication of her criminal enterprise, but provided no new leads for identifying or locating her. The Cedar Ridge community gradually recovered from the trauma of the Mrs. Moravec case, though the memory of those events influenced local culture for generations. Stories about the incident were passed down through families, often becoming distorted or embellished in the retelling but maintaining the core warning about trusting strangers who offered goods that seemed too remarkable to be authentic. The case became part of local folklore, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers that could hide behind apparently innocent commercial activities. Modern criminal investigators studying historical cases continue to find the Mrs. Moravec operation remarkable for its sophisticated combination of scientific knowledge, psychological manipulation, and systematic planning. The case demonstrates how criminal activities could be sustained over extended periods in pre-modern communication environments, using isolation and limited information sharing to prevent detection. The methods she employed anticipated techniques that would later be associated with more contemporary criminal organizations, suggesting either exceptional innovation or access to knowledge that was far ahead of its time. The chemical processes used to create the garments that formed the centerpiece of Mrs. Moravec's operation were never fully understood despite extensive analysis of recovered materials. The combination of human hair treatment, psychological manipulation compounds, and textile processing methods represented a level of technical sophistication that challenged the scientific understanding of the period. Some aspects of her methodology were not fully explained until advances in organic chemistry and neuroscience provided frameworks for understanding the effects she had achieved. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Mrs. Moravec's operation had been designed not just to acquire victims for processing, but to create a sustainable system that could continue indefinitely without detection. The psychological conditioning of customers, systematic surveillance of community members, and carefully planned disposal methods indicated long-term thinking that suggested she had intended to operate in Cedar Ridge for many years, rather than the brief period that actually occurred. Only Constable Whitman's investigation had disrupted what appeared to be a perfectly planned criminal enterprise. The broader question of how many similar operations might have existed during the same period remained unanswered. The limited communication and investigation capabilities of late 19th century law enforcement meant that criminal activities in remote areas often went undetected or were attributed to natural causes or accidents. Mrs. Moravec's sophisticated methods suggested that other criminals might have been operating similar enterprises without ever being discovered or documented. Investigation records from the period indicate that several other communities reported unusual business operations involving unfamiliar materials or processing methods that created high-quality products with suspicious origins. Most of these reports were dismissed as local rumors or community gossip, but retrospective analysis suggested that some might have been indicators of criminal activities similar to those discovered in Cedar Ridge. The lack of systematic information sharing between law enforcement agencies meant that patterns spanning multiple communities were unlikely to be recognized or investigated. The case files related to Mrs. Moravec's operation eventually became part of the research collection maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for training and historical purposes. Access to these materials was restricted due to the disturbing nature of the evidence and the detailed criminal methodology documented in the case. Researchers studying historical crime patterns or early investigative techniques could obtain permission to review the files, but public access was limited to protect community members whose families had been affected by the original events. The physical evidence recovered from Mrs. Moravec's workshop was retained by federal authorities until the 1960s, when most materials were destroyed according to standard evidence disposal procedures. However, some samples of the treated garments and chemical processing materials were preserved for ongoing research into criminal methodology and toxicology. These samples occasionally provided valuable reference materials for investigators dealing with similar cases involving chemical manipulation of materials or psychological conditioning of victims. The psychological profiles developed during the investigation of Mrs. Moravec's customers provided early insights into the effects of prolonged exposure to behavior-modifying substances and the recovery process from such conditioning. Dr. Heath's detailed medical records became part of the foundational research used to understand how chemical agents could be used to control human behavior without the conscious awareness of victims. This research contributed to later developments in forensic psychology and the treatment of victims in cases involving systematic psychological manipulation. The community of Cedar Ridge never fully returned to its pre-1888 character, though it continued to exist as a viable settlement for several more decades. The population gradually declined as families moved away and fewer new residents chose to settle in an area associated with such notorious events. By the 1920s, Cedar Ridge had become little more than a collection of scattered farms, and the original town center had largely disappeared. The area was eventually incorporated into surrounding municipalities, and the name Cedar Ridge fell out of common use. The site of Mrs. Moravec's cottage became the subject of local superstition and folklore for many years after her disappearance. Despite being cleared and converted to agricultural use, residents continued to report unusual occurrences in the area. Unexplained odors, particularly the sweet scent that had characterized her workshop, and sounds that suggested activity when the location was known to be empty. These reports were generally attributed to psychological effects of the community trauma rather than any genuine anomalous phenomena. Modern agricultural use of the former cottage site required extensive soil remediation to remove chemical contaminants left from Mrs. Moravec's processing operations. Soil samples taken during the 1940s conversion revealed elevated levels of various compounds that had been used in her textile processing methods. The cleanup required removing several feet of contaminated soil and replacing it with clean material before the land could be safely used for crop production. The river path that Mrs. Moravec's conditioned customers had walked during their nighttime episodes became known locally as the Widow's Trail and was generally avoided by residents for decades after her disappearance. The path eventually became overgrown and impassable, though portions of it remain visible until development of the area in the mid-20th century. Some sections of the original path were incorporated into modern recreational trails, though few current users are aware of the historical significance of the route. As Pennsylvania's rural communities modernized and became better connected to urban centers, the type of isolation that had allowed Mrs. Moravec to operate undetected became increasingly rare. Improved transportation, communication systems, and law enforcement coordination made it much more difficult for criminals to establish long-term operations in remote areas without attracting attention. The Mrs. Moravec case became part of the historical record of a period when such criminal enterprises were technically feasible in ways that would be nearly impossible under modern conditions. And yet, even now, more than a century after these events occurred in the hills of western Pennsylvania, questions remain about the true scope and nature of Mrs. Moravec's operations. The sophisticated methods, the scientific expertise, the systematic approach to victim selection and processing all suggest capabilities and knowledge that challenge our understanding of criminal activities in that period. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that her success depended not on elaborate technology or large-scale organization, but simply on the trust of rural communities and the isolation that allowed terrible secrets to remain hidden for far too long. Some historians who have studied the case suggest that the real lesson is not about the crimes themselves, but about how easily evil can disguise itself as commerce, how readily people can be manipulated when their basic needs are involved, and how thin the line really is between civilization and the darkness that can lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding.